Good. I start out with identifying who I am. My name is Ralph Young. I go by the name of D. Ralph Young as an author. And basically, I am the baby of 11 children that were born in central Kentucky. My father was a farmer, and at the age of 10, my mother had a stroke, and being the youngest in the family, my dad said, "Okay, Ralph, you are the houseboy." At 16, I was coming home from a movie in Stanford, Kentucky, and was hitchhiking a ride, and the driver of the car had the radio on, and that was my first knowledge of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Immediately I thought, well, from what I'd been reading, it was going to be a rather long war, it appeared to be. So I just knew I'd be in the service at 18. But when I got to be 17, I realized that if you waited to 18 and were drafted, they put you in whatever service they needed you most. So I really talked my parents into letting me volunteer at 17. So I went in, enlisted in the Navy at 17. They allowed me to finish high school, so I went to finish my high school education and then reported to Great Lakes, Illinois, and did my basic training. So that's kind of the beginning of my life. And the purpose of writing the books that I have about entitled Forgotten Warriors is that I just feel like that the media and the people in the country at this time do not recognize us who fought in the Pacific as much as they do the ones who fought in Europe. Because it seems we celebrate Normandy about every year, but you never hear about Peleliu or Tarawa or Tinian, and many of those had more casualties than D-Day at Normandy. So it's difficult to explain why that is true. Some suggestions saying, well, it's because we all migrated from the European area, so it's just naturally that they would want to support that area of the country more than the Pacific. Europe is closely together, so it's easy for touring, but the Pacific is so vast in its display that you see very few tours to the Pacific Theater, but you see a lot of tours every year and to the European Theater. So another thing probably had influence on it because Eisenhower was a really popular commander, and he also became president of the United States, so that had some influence on people being more thoughtful of the European theater. I start my presentation by looking at the veterans. We had 16 million veterans that were enlisted in the World War II. At the end of 2019, we were dying at a rate of 294 a day, and there was 389,292 survivors. I would say that was the end of 2019, and now I would say there's probably less than 200,000 of us left. And we're probably dying at a little higher rate because of our age being always in the mid to upper 90s. So my slide shows that during World War II, there were 135,567 killed in the European theater and 104,000 We don't say the missing in Europe because I think that's probably because most of the missing were people who drowned during the invasion, and that could have some effect because we had like 50,000 missing in the Pacific. Most of the battles in Europe were land wars, so people didn't drown. The awful thing about this total here is the 96 million estimated civilian deaths during World War II. World War II was the most expensive and most terrible war since our creation. This is area that immediately after Pearl Harbor, this is area that was occupied by Japan. This started in 1870, and the purple is the areas that Japan occupied immediately after Pearl Harbor. So this shows you the magnitude of the campaign in the Pacific, and things being so separated, it was a real challenge. During the early stages of the war, there was a lot of discussion about how to go about defeating Japan, and the generals and admirals couldn't really get together on a plan. So they were all called in to Hawaii, and Roosevelt and a lot of leaders of the country met all the admirals and generals there, and they went into session, and they came out of that session with 3 paths across the Pacific. Number 1 was MacArthur going through the Solomon Islands, Guadalcanal, and Luzon and Leyte, and then Halsey and Nimitz and Spruance chose the central route across the Pacific, and then the northern route was a route no one wanted to fight in because the weather was so bad. The Japanese didn't want to fight, and neither did the Americans. Most of our casualties during that period of time in the north, when we invaded Attu, Kiska, and Adak, a lot of the casualties were from weather conditions. So actually on the northern route, we only just went so far and established a defensive position and stopped there, and that protected us from the Japanese coming that way, and it essentially, Japanese didn't expect us to go across through the Aleutians because of the weather. So then I have, during my presentations and during my book, I singled out some individuals that I thought really had contributed beyond what you would imagine a soldier would have to commit. One such young lad was Richard Cross. You can look at his picture and you can see how young he looked, and that's what inspired me to write more about the book than any other factor of my research. So Richard was a Marine from Minneapolis. He went into the war at Peleliu, and he was seeing his first battle there. And then the battle was furious. The sound was it was just deafening. Mortars and hand grenades and gunfire. And the commanding officer said, I need a stretcher detail of 4 men to go to the front and bring back a wounded comrade. So Richard was one of the 4 that volunteered to go to and recover this wounded soldier. And on their way, the battle got so fierce and so heavy that they had to take cover in a foxhole. And then the battle lifted a little bit and they saw two men coming toward them. They thought they were Americans, and they demanded a password, and instead of a password, they had a hand grenade thrown into the middle of them. Richard, without any hesitation, dove his body on top of the hand grenade and absorbed all the blast and saved his three comrades. For that, he was awarded the Medal of Honor. And I just think of, he looked so young, and to think that a young soldier like that would give his life is really difficult to understand. There are other young 18-year-olds, and there's Ralph Young. In the Navy, I was David R. Young. You give up your given name, and the Navy doesn't care what, or the military doesn't care what your middle name is. All they know is your name is David, first name and middle initial and last. So that's why I went through the service as David R. Young. And I was in the gunner's mate, and this is a group of the gunner's mates that I served with on the ship. This is the ship that I served on in its camouflage condition. It's called an APA, and what is an APA? An APA is Amphibious Personnel Attack. And the duty of the APA is to pick up the troops at their base and land them on an island to be invaded. Then in addition to that, they have to send what they call a party, beach party. They call it a beach party because the guns would jam on the boats, the LCVPs that we took the troops in on, and supplies would get bogged down on the shore. So we had to have a beach party from each ship to go in and be there to repair the guns and to move the equipment and supplies away from the beach to keep it from getting bogged down. To accomplish that, that's where I say the beach party was responsible. Then the initial start across the Pacific was started in Aleutians and the Solomon Islands. In the Aleutians, my ship was in all three invasions at Adak, Attu, and Kiska. And in the Solomons was initiated about the same time. And I have a story about a young man there that I want to tell. And his name is Jacob Valdez. Jacob was educated in the South Seas Missionary School on Guadalcanal, which was his home. And he was in the police force for about 25 years. And he decided to retire at 25 years and move back to his home in Guadalcanal. And doing so, he aligned himself with what the Australians call coast watchers. Australia had this program where they had missionaries or farmers or people that did trade in the islands, and they would ask them to keep their eyes open about any unusual activity, and they had radios that they were able to contact with. So that's what Jacob did. Jacob took the name Jacob after he was converted to Christianity. So he had retired and gone back to Guadalcanal, and while there, the WASP had some pilots that were in combat over the island of Guadalcanal. One was shot down, and he parachuted to safety. Jacob was able to find him and lead him back to the American positions. So he then became very well associated with the Marines. And then as he was doing his duty and living there, the Japanese captured him. And they searched him and they found an American flag that a Marine had given him. So they tied him to a tree and tried to get him to give away the American positions and the strength of the American army in the area. He refused, and the commander finally said, "Don't shoot him because it'll give away our position, but bayoneted him, to use a bayonet and kill him." So they bayoneted him in the stomach, in the cheek, in the arms, and left him for dead. He didn't die, and as soon as the Japanese left, he chewed through the ropes that bound him, and he crawled through the jungle several miles to the American position. And when he got there, he told them about the Japanese and their intent to strike, and gave them a position and strength. And it was really ended up being the first defeat of the Japanese on land. And it was all because of his courageousness. He was awarded a Silver Star by the Americans, and also a Legion of Merit by the U.S. He was also awarded the George Medal from Britain, and also they erected a statue for him in one of the Solomon Islands that still exists today. So that was Jacob Voles, a local individual who had his heart set on serving the American and the English forces. In the killed to wounded ratio, it gives you a good indication of how the battle between Europe and the Pacific was fought. The Japanese at that time and up to the war was over were what you would consider a barbaric nation. Their effort and their intent was fight to your death, because that's what they committed themselves to their emperor. So for the Americans, we had, for every one killed, we had 3 wounded. And that is the best ratio among all the other Canadian or Britain or Russia or Australia. They're all much worse than 1 to 3. And I credit that to the training and the expertise of our medics and corpsmen. So for the Japanese, however, it is 18 killed for 1 wounded. And that's why it is 5 times more likely that we in the Pacific would be killed than our counterparts in Europe, and 3 times more likely to be wounded, and twice as likely to be a POW. And if you were a POW in Europe, you had a survival rate of about 1% with the Germans and Italians. In the Pacific, under Japanese, the survival rate was over 40%. Now, this is veterans buried on foreign soils. We have 9,403 at Normandy, 17,206 at the American Cemetery in Manila. We have 23 Medal of Honors there and 3 here. Every president since Carter has visited Normandy, and some twice, and only Clinton and Obama have visited the Manila Cemetery. That's the American Cemetery in Manila. My guess is that the people love to go to Paris more than they love to go to Manila, so I think that's what gets them in that direction. Then another battle that was a turning point in the war was the Battle of Midway. I don't know if you've seen the recent movie, but it's really great and real true story of the battles. But just it's not in depth enough to tell you about like John Warden's squadron of 15 pilots and 15 gunners, 30 men in 15 planes. They went into battle against the Japanese at Midway, and only one survived. That one was the center one here, George Gay from Waco, Texas. He was shot down, but he bailed out and landed in the midst of the Japanese fleet. But when his plane hit the area, he was able to manage to get a seat out from a flotation seat, and the Japanese were strafing everything that moved in the sea, and so he managed to keep that cushion over his head, and he could see the faces of the Japanese gunning everybody, but he was concealed with this cushion, and he survived. He stayed in the water for 30 hours, and the Japanese fleet moved on, and then a PBY discovered him and landed and picked him up, brought him back. So he survived, and he was the only survivor of those 30 men. He retired from the Navy and went back to Waco and then started flying for TWA. At 77, he passed away, and his wife fulfilled his wishes of being cremated and his ashes taken back to the area of where Midway was fought and scattered over the water so he could join his comrades. That's the type of people that I serve with, and I'm so proud to have been a server of those. During the war and the medals awarded, there were 464 total during the war. These are Medal of Honors, and 266 of them were posthumously, and about 200 some plus, nearly 200 in the Pacific. This was my first battle in the Pacific, and that's what the beach looked like when we went ashore. I was not in the first wave, I was in about the second or third wave, and the beach was pretty well littered with dead bodies. So Saipan was critical battle because the Japanese knew that if we took Saipan, that the homeland would be subject to our B-29 bombers, which had a range of about 1,500 miles, and Japan was only 1,300 miles away. So they did everything possible to put their fleet together to go to stop the invasion of Saipan. Admiral Spruance got word that the Jap fleet was about 180 miles west of Saipan, and so not knowing the results of the battle, he immediately ordered all of the transports out of the area, and that was an immediate order. And so all the ships that had people on the shore, like our beach party, never got a chance to get back to the ship. We had to live on the beach for about 2 weeks before the battle was over in the Philippine Sea. So that was one of the things that gave a real rough time on Saipan, because we had to confiscate the food from the Marines and from the Army. I remember getting a box of food off of a slide that was coming down the beach, and the man who was in charge of it stopped me and said, "You can't do that, that's officers' food." And I said, well, I told him my story, and he said, are you kidding me? He said, go ahead and take another one. So I went back to my group with about 20 of us, and we had officer supplies. And it was quite different because it had candy bars and peanut butter and all kinds of refreshments in it. So this was the Battle of Saipan. The person that I want to bring your attention to is Obie O'Brien. His real name is William O'Brien, but his troops called him Obie. He was small in stature, but a really enthusiastic and active individual. He was involved in the battles throughout. On one occasion, he was the Marines, or the tank crews, got mixed up and were firing back on his troops. So he went across an open field that under fire by the Japanese, and dodged and ducked in and dodged the bullets and made the tank and hammered on the turret with his pistol. And they opened it, and he got them turned around so that they were firing back toward the Japanese. And then he got up on the tank and with his two pistols was just firing away. He didn't get wounded, but he jumped down off the tank and picked up a wounded sailor and carried him back to the medics. And then another time, near the end of the battle, most people have read about the massacre of the Japanese, how they mustered together about 5,000 of their remaining troops, and they managed to initiate a banzai charge. This was when the bodies built up so high that gunners had to move their tripods up to shoot over the pile. And William O'Brien ran up and down the line shouting to his troops, "Don't give them a damn inch." And all the time he was firing two 45 pistols. Then he ran out of ammunition with his pistols, so a wounded soldier had a gun laying by him. He picked up the guy's rifle and continued firing. And then on top of that, he ran out of ammunition, and there was a Jeep stranded, but the gun was in place on top, so he mounted that Jeep and got the 50 caliber machine gun, and that was his last effort, because he got killed while standing on that Jeep firing his 50 millimeter. And for that, he got the Medal of Honor winner, but he was really a soldier that you have to admire, and just was so idolized by his troops and you can understand why, anyone with the courage and determination that he demonstrated. So the next guy that I want to talk about is similar to him. He is also from Troy, New York. His name is Thomas Baker. Thomas Baker was in this same crew that William O'Brien was, but he was assigned to come up in the back and protect the troops from the rear, because the Japanese had built caves and tunnels so that they would circle around when the troops moved through. They think, and they'd clean the area. Well, through their series of tunnels, they would pop up behind and attack the troops from behind. So Thomas Baker was his, and he personally destroyed two 20-man Japanese emplacements single-handedly. And then he was fighting in this banzai charge that came, and he was wounded. A medic was trying to get him back to the back lines for medical treatment, and the medic got wounded. So Baker said, "Look, I'm finished. You just get yourself back there, prop me up against that tree, give me a pistol and a cigarette." And the medic did that. He propped him up against the tree and gave him a pistol, which had 8 rounds of ammunition in it. And Thomas Baker sat there and smoked his cigarette. The next morning, when the troops moved out again because they had moved back to a defensive position the night before, that's why they left him up there. But then they moved forward the next morning. There was Baker leaning up against a tree with a cigarette butt clinging to his lips. The gun was on the ground and empty, and there was 8 Japanese soldiers laying around him. So he was awarded the Medal of Honor for that. So he's one of my idols also. This is Tinian, the adjacent to Saipan. Everybody that talks to me knows I have trouble hearing, and my hearing started here on Saipan. Those are artillery emplacements that were bombarding Tinian for our invasion of Tinian coming on July the 24th. So that's where I know ringing in my ear started, and it was deafening continuously. So the island of Tinian is only about 14 miles long and about 4 miles wide. So the plan was the only decent beach for landing was here at Tinian Town. That was a wide open beach, sand, very little coral, so it was easy accessible. So the plan was to come bring the ships down here and fake a landing toward that, but allow the actual landing to happen on the northwest coast. And I was part of this group that went on the northwest coast. My ship was here doing the fake landing, but prior to this, I had, and all of us on the beach party, had been transferred to the APA 37, and we went in with the D-Day invasion of the troops. So this next slide shows you why they were concerned about the coral. You can see how it's been bulldozed out a little bit here, but coral is so bad. What I was responsible for was bringing in a floating barge over in this area, and the barge extended out past the coral, and we were able to load the jeeps and the personnel off onto the barge and get them ashore. So that's the nice thing is that when we landed, it was minimum fire because the fake worked. The fake had drawn the Japanese south, and with Tinian being so flat and narrow, the ships offshore kept them pinned down and they couldn't move back to the north. So we had little resistance, thank goodness, because it was difficult landing, as you can see in the coral. LCVP boats draw about 5 feet of water when they're loaded. So you can see the water here is knee deep, so it's nowhere near deep enough to let the boats get in over. So they have to offload and then walk in or barrel their way in. Now this, again, is Saipan. This is Saipan on the day that we landed, and this is the way we got to the beach, and this is what we saw when we got. And I had the fortune to go back there in 2017, and that's the same beach that I was on in the war. So you can see a remarkable difference between the beaches. But this gives you a good example of how boats are offloaded and people wading in and under fire. So it takes a courageous individual to keep up their spirits. One thing happened on Saipan when I was there is that the local natives, the Chamorros, or the natives of the Mariana Islands, and that includes Saipan and Tinian, they found out that I was in the D-Day invasion of both Saipan and Tinian. So without telling us anything other than we're going to have a ceremony tomorrow at the American Memorial Park on Saipan, and your tour group is invited to come and encouraged to come. So we knew that they wanted us to come, so we went the next day, and little unknowing to me until that moment, they said, "Mr. Young, would you step forward?" And they gave me this medal, which is for valor in the Pacific, and inscribed with the words, "Our grateful islands remember." So I can tell you, they treated me and my wife like king and queens. We were, everywhere we went, we were met with groups who wanted to hug and kiss and tell the stories. This young man told me that his father joined the Americans immediately after the Japanese, immediately after the Americans landed. So he was proud of the fact that his father fought along with the Americans. And he told me that his father, he was one of 22 children. And I asked him how many children he had, and he said, "I have 5. And I said, what's the problem?" He said, "Television." So he was a very joking man. And so one other individual I need to tell you about is Desmond Doss. Desmond Doss was a private in the Army. He was a conscientious objector. He wouldn't carry a gun, but he wanted to serve his country. And a lot of battles went on about getting him discharged or kicked out of the Army. But they finally decided that if he wanted to be a medic, a corpsman, they would allow him to do that. So that's the basis on which he went into the service, is that he didn't have to fire a gun. So on Okinawa, the Americans were scaling a 400-foot plateau that was flat on the top, and the Japanese were well dug in. So they made it to the top, and through heavy gunfire and grenades, a lot of wounded people happened, and this young man fought through all those battles and ministered to the wounded, and on his own accord had lowered 75 wounded men off that channel, and the channel that he was using was just opposite where we were standing. The rock there marks the spot, and they have since put a fence up because there's a steep bluff there that falls over. And that's where he was lowering in body bags wounded people to the medics below on the ground. So he ended up being shot in the leg, and he was loaded on a stretcher and was being carted back to the medics. And the gunfire got so bad, the medics had to put him down. And he crawled off that and witnessed and served another wounded man that he felt was more critical than himself. And in doing so, he got wounded in the arm. He used his a rifle butt to put a splint on his arm, and he continued to lower people whenever he was the last man off the plateau. So he also was awarded the Medal of Honor. This is Okinawa. Okinawa, before this was Leyte, and I don't have too much to show about Leyte, except that it's the first time in the war that the Japanese used kamikaze planes. And they, after that, they took it up as a offensive weapon. So kamikazes became the dreaded bomb after Leyte. So they really employed it at Okinawa, and also they employed speedboats with bombs. So we had to fight both bombing from the air and also bombing from the water. So at Okinawa, my responsibility there was laying smoke. We tried our best to cover the harbor in enough smoke so that the kamikaze planes couldn't spot a ship to hit. So that was my duty, and there must have been a dozen more doing the same thing, because some of our fellows got wounded as a result in the smoke boats. So we came close to being wounded, not by Japanese, but by friendly fire. We were coming up onto a ship, and they challenged us, and the ensign that was in charge of the smoke crew that I was on had a flashlight that he was supposed to signal that gave them a warning that we were American friendly forces. But he dropped it, and we all hit the bilges, and this gunboat opened fire on us with small weapons. And the ensign found the light and was able to get it up over the top without getting wounded, and got the firing to stop. So we then went aboard this little gunship, and they treated us like royalty. They were so ashamed that they fired upon us. But and then it was their first experience in battle, so it was really frightening for them. But it just, those things do happen, no matter what. So this is Tinian, and that's where they loaded the atom bomb for Hiroshima. They have it enclosed now as a monument. And on the island of Tinian, to the north, and just a few hundred feet from where we landed on D-Day, was a Japanese airport. Now that the Seabees, after on July the 24th, 8 days after the landing, there was only 8,000 of the 8,800 troops left on, and they surrendered. So the Seabees, in 4 months later, had made this the busiest airport in World War II. From there, they were bombing Japan, Formosa at that time, and Philippines, where Japs are still occupied. So a lot of bombing of the islands that were conquered by the Japanese were bombed from this runway. And on August the 6th, 1945, Colonel Paul Tibbets loaded the left runway Able for Hiroshima. And 3 days later, Major Charles Sweeney left the same roadway for a city called Kokura. When he got to Kokura, the overcast was so hard they couldn't pick the target, so they went on to Nagasaki. So that's why Nagasaki was a secondary target, and that's why they got it. So this could, with all meaning, it could be the most historical airstrip on the face of the earth, because 16 hours after Nagasaki, the Emperor of Japan, without consulting anyone, decided to end the war. I know it sounds awful to kill 120, 140,000 people with A-bombs, but the planning for the invasion of Japan, which was rapidly approaching, the planners had ordered 1,500,000 Purple Hearts. I say this because Purple Heart is awarded at the site on the battlefield. So they were planning for 1,500,000 Purple Hearts. And if you take the 3-to-1 ratio of kill, then you can expect that we would have lost at least 500,000 troops in trying to conquer. And one thing more I would say is that Japanese were not taught to surrender. I dare say that if we had not used A-bombs, we'd still be fighting Japanese rebels in Japan, because they would never have surrendered. They would melt it into the countryside and survive, like the one on Guam who lived for 27 years after the island was conquered by the U.S., and all the information that came, he thought was American propaganda, so he didn't want to surrender. At 95, my passions are as follows. To tell the world about what my comrades did to win the war in the Pacific, to acknowledge the power of a mother's prayer that put me through World War II and gave me a successful engineering career, plus a beautiful life. So that's my passions, and that's what I'm living for, and that's what I'm continuing to do, and that's why I've written the books about the war in the Pacific, because I want to glorify my comrades who fought there. And that's the end of my presentation.